Our story begins with the dying of the light. Stand with us in a busy street in ancient Rome, near the Forum. The sun, a fiery bronze coin, sinks behind the Capitoline hill, painting the marble temples in hues of orange and purple. The air, thick all day with the smells of commerce, of baking bread, hot metal from the blacksmiths, and the sweat of 1,000,000 people, now begins to change. The noise, a constant deafening hum of life, begins to subside. You hear a new set of sounds taking over, the heavy, rhythmic thud of wooden shutters being dropped into place, the grating scrape of iron bars being slid across doorways, the calls of merchants packing away their wares for the day. The city is holding its breath. The working day, the life of the sunlit hours, is over. Now begins the time of caution, the reign of darkness. For the Rome of the Caesars was a city without streetlights. Once the sun was gone, a profound and almost total darkness would descend upon the most powerful city in the world. The grand public squares might retain a sliver of ambient moonlight, but the vast majority of the city, the narrow, winding alleys, the towering tenement blocks, the labyrinthine districts like the Subura, would be plunged into an inky, dangerous blackness. This was not the romantic, twinkling darkness of a modern city at night. It was a thick, oppressive, and tangible void. The familiar landmarks of the day dissolved into menacing, unseen shapes. The world shrank to what little you could see by the light of your own small, flickering oil lamp, its tiny flame casting huge, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eye. To step out into the Roman night was to step into another world, a world where the rules were different, and where survival depended on your wits, your wallet, or the strength of your right arm.
Navigating this darkened city was a physical challenge before any human threat even presented itself. The streets of Rome were notoriously poorly maintained. The paving stones, where they existed, were often uneven and treacherous, slick with filth. A misplaced step in the dark could easily result in a twisted ankle or a nasty fall. In the poorer districts, many alleys were not paved at all, but were simply packed earth, which would turn into a thick, sucking mud after a rain shower. Then there was the problem of sanitation. Rome's famous sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, served only the lowest parts of the city. For the hundreds of thousands of people living in the tall apartment blocks, the insulae, the solution for disposing of household waste was far simpler. They threw it out of the window. All day and all night, the air in the narrow streets was filled with falling debris. The jurist Ulpian speaks plainly of the things a person might be hit with, not just solid waste, but broken pottery, dirty water, and the contents of chamber pots. Special laws existed to deal with the injuries caused by these falling objects, but that was little comfort to the person walking below. Every step was a gamble. You would hug the walls, your senses on high alert, listening for the ominous sound of a window shutter creaking open above you. The darkness hid not just human dangers, but a constant barrage of refuse from the sky and a landscape of treacherous footing below. Just making it home from a late dinner party was an achievement in itself. Into this physical darkness, a new soundscape was born. The roar of the daytime city was replaced by a quieter, more unsettling collection of noises that carried eerily through the narrow streets. The most common sound was the barking and howling of the city's innumerable stray dogs, forming packs that roamed the alleys, fighting for scraps. Their calls would echo through the night, a constant, mournful backdrop to the city's slumber. You would hear the creaks and groans of the poorly constructed insulae, buildings that were often thrown up quickly and cheaply by unscrupulous landlords, their wooden beams straining under the weight. You would hear the distant, muffled sound of a late-night party in a wealthy villa, the faint notes of a lyre or the burst of drunken laughter carrying on the still air. But more often, you would hear sounds of trouble, a sudden shout followed by the sound of running feet, a window smashing, the sharp, percussive crack of a brawl breaking out in a back-alley tavern. And then there were the human sounds of passage, the slow, shuffling footsteps of a lone walker trying to make their way home unnoticed, the sharp, rhythmic tramp of a patrol of the vigiles, the night watch, making their rounds. And the most feared sound of all for a person of means, the sudden quickening footsteps behind you, the low whisper from the shadows. These were the sounds that made every citizen bar their doors securely, a nightly reminder that the city, once stripped of its sunlit crowds, belonged to the desperate and the predatory.
The experience of the Roman night was, above all, a story of class. The city after dark was effectively two different worlds, experienced in entirely different ways by the rich and the poor. For a wealthy senator or rich merchant, the night held inconvenience, but not necessarily terror. His home, his domus, was a private fortress. The single, heavy wooden door was barred and locked from the inside, often watched over by a large, intimidating doorkeeper slave, the eonator, who might even be chained to his post as a sign of his unwavering vigilance. The high, windowless outer walls of the villa presented a blank, unassailable face to the dark street. If this wealthy Roman needed to venture out at night, perhaps to attend a dinner party that ran late, he would not go alone. He would be carried in a litter, a lectica, on the shoulders of at least 4 and perhaps as many as 8 strong slaves. He would be preceded by other slaves carrying torches or lanterns, creating a moving bubble of light and safety. And alongside his litter would walk his personal bodyguards, armed and ready to deter any would-be attacker. For him, the night was a spectacle to be observed from a position of security and comfort. Contrast this with the experience of a poor plebeian, a shopkeeper, a craftsman, a dock worker, living on the 3rd floor of a crowded, rickety insula. His single-room apartment had no private toilet, no running water, and a flimsy door that could be easily forced. When he stepped out into the night, he stepped out alone. He had no slaves with torches, no bodyguards. He had only his own 2 feet and whatever courage he could muster. For him, the darkness was not a spectacle. It was a real and present danger. The same street was, for these 2 men, 2 entirely different places.
For those who could afford it, personal security was a private matter, not a state concern. The Roman elite's reliance on their own enslaved workforce for protection was absolute. The very slaves who served them dinner were also their first line of defense against the dangers of the night. A large, physically imposing slave was a status symbol, a visible deterrent to any who might wish the master harm. The doorkeeper, the litter bearers, the personal attendants, all were chosen for their loyalty and their physical presence. This created a strange dynamic of trust and fear within the household itself. The master's life was literally in the hands of the people he legally owned and often treated with casual cruelty. This reliance on enslaved bodyguards was a constant feature of Roman life, a silent admission that the state could not or would not protect its own citizens, especially not its wealthiest. This privatization of security extended to public figures. Ambitious politicians and powerful generals surrounded themselves with what were essentially private armies composed of their own slaves, freedmen, and loyal clients. These were not just bodyguards, they were instruments of political will. A candidate for office would use his entourage to intimidate rivals, to protect his supporters at the polls, and to project an image of strength and power. The line between personal security and a private gang was often blurry, and as the Roman Republic began to crumble, this line would be crossed with increasing and bloody frequency. The safety of the individual, whether in his home or in the forum, depended entirely on the strength he could personally command.
If the Palatine Hill with its guarded aristocratic villas was one side of nighttime Rome, the Subura was its opposite. This was a vast, densely populated valley nestled between the hills, the city's most infamous and vibrant slum. By day, it was a bustling, chaotic neighborhood of workshops, brothels, taverns, and crowded markets. By night, it transformed into the beating heart of Rome's criminal underworld. The streets here were a tangled, narrow maze, and the insulae apartment blocks towered up to 6 or 7 stories, blocking out what little moonlight might reach the ground. This was a place where a person could disappear. The darkness was absolute, the alleys confusing even to those who lived there. It was the natural hunting ground for every kind of criminal: the desperate mugger, the professional burglar, the runaway slave, the hired assassin. The Roman satirist Juvenal, writing about the dangers of the city, paints a vivid picture of the Subura at night. He speaks of the constant fear of being doused with waste from an upper-story window, of being jostled and beaten in a drunken brawl, or of being accosted by a swaggering bully looking for a fight. He advises his readers to make out their will before they venture out for dinner at night. While played for comedic exaggeration, his portrayal reflects a genuine fear that all Romans felt about this legendary neighborhood. The Subura was the place where the thin veneer of Roman law and order was stripped away completely after dark, revealing the raw, violent, and desperate reality that lay beneath.
This pervasive atmosphere of danger bred a deep-seated culture of fear around the very concept of the night. For the average Roman, the night was not a time for leisure or recreation. It was a time of inactivity and confinement. The phrase "to keep indoors," domi sit tenere, was synonymous with safety and prudence. The ideal was to finish all of your business during the daylight hours, return home before sunset, and secure your door until the next morning. This fear was reflected in Roman literature and letters. Cicero and Pliny the Younger both speak of the dangers of traveling at night. The law itself seemed to acknowledge the heightened threat. For example, a homeowner who caught a burglar in his house at night was legally permitted to kill him on the spot, a right he did not have if he caught him during the day. The law recognized that a nighttime intruder posed a mortal threat. This fear created a city of self-imposed curfews. The grand public spaces, which were the center of life during the day, became empty, desolate voids at night. The Roman Forum, the heart of the empire, a place of commerce, law, and politics, would be largely deserted after dark, its great basilicas and temples looming like silent, sleeping giants. The city effectively shut down. This nightly retreat, this abandonment of the public space to the darkness, created a power vacuum. And into this vacuum stepped the men who saw the night not as a time of fear, but as a time of opportunity.
And so we have set the stage, a city plunged into darkness, its streets treacherous and largely unpoliced. A city of stark contrasts, where the wealthy lock themselves away in private fortresses, while the poor are left to fend for themselves in sprawling, dangerous slums. A city where fear is the dominant emotion once the sun has set. This is the environment in which crime in ancient Rome was allowed to flourish. This was the world inhabited by the grassatores, the street muggers who lurked in the unlit alleyways, ready to pounce on any lone traveler. It was the hunting ground of the effractores, the burglars who specialized in breaking into the flimsy doors of the city's apartment blocks. And it was the battlefield for the politically motivated gangs who used the cover of darkness to intimidate their rivals and spread fear. As we continue our journey tonight, we will leave behind the general atmosphere of the Roman night and begin to meet these individuals. We will explore the specific crimes they committed, from the petty theft in the Forum to the grand corruption in the Senate. We will see how a society without a proper police force tried and often failed to dispense justice. And we will see how that justice was applied in vastly different ways, depending on whether you were a man of wealth and status or a humble citizen with nothing but the tunic on your back. The city is dark, the doors are barred. Let us now walk the streets of the Roman underworld.
In this city of shadows, a different kind of commerce thrives, a nocturnal economy of violence and theft. Let us first meet its most common practitioner, the grassator. This was the Roman term for a street robber, a mugger, a footpad. He was the subject of endless complaints in Roman literature and a source of constant, visceral fear for the city's inhabitants. The grassatores were not master criminals. They were brutal opportunists who used the darkness as their greatest ally. They typically worked in small groups, lurking in the unlit archways, the dark side streets, or the narrow alleys that provided easy ambush points and quick escape routes. Their victims were chosen based on opportunity: a lone traveler, a drunkard stumbling home from a tavern, or a citizen who appeared to be a person of some means but was foolish enough to be walking without an armed escort. The attack would be sudden and violent. A figure would emerge from the shadows, perhaps joined by 2 or 3 others, blocking the victim's path. Their methods were direct. While some might carry a concealed knife or a heavy club, their primary weapon was the threat of overwhelming force. They would surround their target, rough him up, and demand his purse, his cloak, any valuables he might be carrying. Resistance was ill-advised. A victim who fought back risked a severe beating or worse. The goal of the grassator was simple profit, but he was not afraid to use violence to achieve it. After the robbery, they would melt back into the labyrinthine streets of the Subura, their victim left shaken, bruised, and poorer, with little hope of ever seeing his property or justice again.
While the grassatores ruled the night, a different, more subtle kind of thief worked in the bright, chaotic daylight of the city's public spaces. These were the pickpockets and the cut purses, known as sacularii, a name which literally means bag snatchers. Their hunting ground was any place where a large, distracted crowd gathered: the bustling markets, the entrance to the public baths, the Circus Maximus during a chariot race, and especially the Roman Forum. Imagine the Forum on a busy afternoon. It is the heart of the world, a chaotic swirl of activity. Senators are debating on the steps of the Curia, lawyers are arguing cases in the open-air basilicas, merchants are hawking their wares, and citizens are simply meeting to exchange news and gossip. The noise is a deafening hum. In this dense, distracted crowd, the sacularius was in his element. He was a master of stealth and misdirection. He would often work in teams. One might create a small disturbance, bumping into a target or pointing to something in the sky, while his accomplice would deftly slit the strings of the victim's money pouch or simply lift it from their belt. The best of them were like ghosts. The victim would feel nothing, only discovering their loss hours later when they went to pay for a loaf of bread or a cup of wine. This was a crime of skill, not violence, but it was just as infuriating for the victim. The amounts stolen were often small, but they were a constant drain, a tax levied on the underworld on the daily life of the city. Catching such a thief was nearly impossible. By the time the crime was discovered, the sacularius and his team had vanished back into the anonymous sea of the Roman crowd.
The homes of the Roman poor were just as vulnerable as their purses. The vast majority of the city's population lived in the towering tenement blocks known as insulae. These were often shoddy, poorly constructed buildings thrown up by landlords looking to make a quick profit. The doors were flimsy, the locks were simple, and the shared stairways and courtyards offered little security. This made them the perfect target for the Roman burglar, the effractor. The effractor was a specialist in forced entry. His name comes from the Latin verb for to break out, but it was applied to those who broke in. They worked at night, using the darkness and the noise of the city to cover their activities. They might use a crowbar to pry open a weak door frame or simply kick it in. Once inside the small, single-room apartment, they would work quickly, grabbing any small, portable items of value, a piece of pottery, a set of bronze utensils, a spare tunic, a small stash of coins hidden under a floorboard. For the victims, who often had very few possessions to begin with, the loss could be devastating. And like the victim of a mugging, they had little recourse. There was no police force to call to investigate the crime. They could report it to the owner of the building, but he was unlikely to do anything. The only hope was to ask around the neighborhood to see if anyone had seen or heard anything, but this rarely yielded results. The crime was so common that it was often seen as just another unfortunate fact of life in the big city, another hardship to be endured by the multitude who lived on the lower rungs of the Roman social ladder.
Beyond these acts of individual and small-scale crime, Rome also had a thriving, if unconventional, form of organized crime. It did not take the form of mafia families in the modern sense. Instead, it was intrinsically linked to the city's social and political structures, operating through organizations known as collegia. On the surface, a collegium was a perfectly legal and respectable organization. It was a guild, a trade union, or a social club. There were collegia for silversmiths, for bakers, for boatmen on the Tiber, and even for undertakers. They were a vital part of the city's social fabric, providing a sense of community and mutual support for their members. However, these seemingly innocuous clubs had a darker side. Because they could organize and control large groups of men, they were a potent source of power. An ambitious politician or a wealthy businessman could take control of a collegium and use its members as his personal army, a ready-made gang to enforce his will. The guild's meetings could be used to plan criminal activities, and its communal funds could be used to bribe officials or hire thugs. Under the veneer of a legitimate trade association, a collegium could operate as a protection racket, extorting money from local shopkeepers. It could be used to manipulate prices at the market. And most importantly, in the turbulent final decades of the Roman Republic, these collegia were weaponized. They were transformed into private militias for populist politicians who used them to intimidate their rivals, to break up public meetings, and to control the streets of Rome through violence and fear. The line between a social club and a criminal gang was, more often than not, hopelessly blurred.
No figure better exemplifies the weaponization of the collegia than Publius Clodius Pulcher. Clodius was a populist politician from an ancient patrician family who, in the mid-1st century BC, became one of the most powerful and feared men in Rome. He was a master of mob politics, and his primary instruments of power were the gangs he controlled, which were drawn from the city's trade guilds and social clubs. Clodius was a demagogue, a man who styled himself as the champion of the common people, the plebs, but his methods were those of a gang leader. He began by getting laws passed that legalized all collegia, which had previously been restricted. This allowed him to organize and fund dozens of these clubs, which became, in effect, his private street gangs. His followers were fiercely loyal, drawn from the ranks of the urban poor, freedmen, and even slaves, whom he promised grain, political influence, and a sense of belonging. He gave them a voice, but he also gave them clubs and daggers. Clodius's gangs were a constant disruptive presence in the city. They would attend public assemblies to shout down his political opponents, including the famous orator Cicero, who was one of Clodius's most bitter enemies. They would start riots to protest against laws they didn't like. They would physically attack the supporters of rival politicians, turning the sacred space of the Roman Forum into a scene of violent brawls. Clodius understood that in a city with no police force, the man who controlled the streets controlled the political agenda. He used organized crime as a tool of statecraft, a way to terrorize the Senate and bend the Roman Republic to his will. The tactics employed by Clodius and his gangs were a masterclass in urban disruption and political intimidation. He didn't just rely on spontaneous riots. His operations were well organized and strategically deployed. For example, if a political rival was due to give a speech in the forum, Clodius's gangs would arrive early and occupy the key positions surrounding the speaker's platform. When the rival began to speak, they would unleash a torrent of abuse, jeers, and organized chanting to drown him out. If that didn't work, they would escalate to throwing stones or filth. Violence was a constant threat. The members of his gangs were often armed with clubs hidden beneath their togas, and sometimes with daggers. Street fights were common. They would target the homes of his enemies, breaking windows, throwing firebrands, and laying siege to their property. They even went so far as to burn down the house of Cicero after they had successfully driven him into exile. This was not random hooliganism, it was targeted political terrorism. Clodius also used his gangs to control the voting process. During elections, his men would surround the polling places, intimidating citizens who were known to support the opposition, sometimes physically blocking them from casting their votes. They would create disturbances to invalidate a day's voting if it seemed to be going against their candidate. In essence, Clodius used his organized gangs to systematically dismantle the norms of Roman political life, replacing debate with violence and votes with fear. He showed that the Roman Republic's institutions were fragile and could be brought to a standstill by a man with enough audacity and a loyal mob at his back.
The unchecked reign of Clodius's gangs could not last forever. The Roman aristocracy, and particularly his political enemies, realized that the only way to counter his mob was to fight fire with fire. This led to the rise of his great rival, Titus Annius Milo. Milo was another politician from the conservative aristocratic faction, and he decided to adopt Clodius's own tactics against him. He began to organize his own private army, using his vast personal wealth to hire his own gangs of thugs and gladiators. If Clodius drew his support from the urban poor, Milo drew his from retired soldiers, rural citizens, and professional fighters. He effectively created a rival criminal enterprise for the express purpose of combating Clodius. The result was that the streets of Rome became the battlefield for a full-blown gang war between two powerful politicians. For several years in the 50s BC, the city was in a state of near constant low-level civil war. The supporters of Clodius and Milo would clash openly in the forum, armed with swords and daggers. Public business was brought to a halt. Elections were postponed for months on end because the violence was so extreme that it was impossible to hold a vote. The consuls, the highest magistrates of the Republic, were often powerless to intervene, as their own official bodyguards were no match for the private armies of these two men. The situation escalated to the point where both Clodius and Milo would travel everywhere in the city, surrounded by hundreds of armed followers. It was a complete breakdown of law and order, a descent into anarchy driven by the personal ambition of two men.
Let us try to picture the scene. It is a day of a planned public assembly in the Roman Forum, but instead of citizens gathering to listen to speeches, two rival armies are assembling. On the steps of the temple of Castor and Pollux,
Clodius's men are gathered, a rough crowd drawn from the city slums, armed with clubs they have pulled from a nearby construction site. On the other side of the square, near the Basilica Aemilia, Milo's faction stands ready, a more disciplined-looking group containing professional gladiators hired for the occasion, their muscular bodies and scarred faces a clear message of intent. The air is thick with tension. Insults are shouted across the square. A stone is thrown, then another. Suddenly, the two factions surge towards each other. The Forum, the sacred heart of Roman law and civilization, erupts into a chaotic, swirling melee. Men are beaten to the ground with clubs. Daggers flash in the sun. The paving stones are slick with blood. Terrified citizens and merchants flee for safety, barricading themselves in the nearby shops and temples. This was the reality of Rome during the gang wars of Clodius and Milo. The political process had been replaced by open street combat. The state had lost its monopoly on violence. The power lay not with the Senate or the magistrates, but with whichever gang leader could muster the most thugs on any given day. It was a clear and terrifying sign that the Roman Republic was dying. Its institutions were hollow, and its future would be decided not by votes, but by the sword. A grim foreshadowing of the full-scale civil wars that would soon bring the Republic to its final, bloody end.
The escalating gang war between Clodius and Milo could only end in one way, with the death of one of the protagonists. This climax arrived in January of 52 BC, not in a planned battle in the Forum, but in a chance encounter on one of Rome's most famous highways. Milo was traveling on the Appian Way, leaving Rome for his hometown. He was in a carriage with his wife, but as was typical for the time, he was accompanied by a large and heavily armed retinue of slaves and gladiators. By coincidence, Clodius was traveling on the same road, on horseback, heading towards Rome, also with his own armed entourage. The two groups passed each other without incident, but then some of Milo's men at the rear of the column picked a fight with some of Clodius's slaves. Insults were exchanged, a scuffle broke out, and Clodius himself, hearing the commotion, turned back and rode into the fray. He was wounded by a spear thrown by one of Milo's gladiators. The wounded Clodius was carried by his followers into a nearby tavern to tend to his injuries. For Milo, this was a critical moment. He could have continued on his journey, leaving the wounded Clodius behind, but he knew that a wounded Clodius would be an even more dangerous and vengeful enemy. He made a fateful calculation. A dead enemy was far less trouble than a wounded one. He ordered his men to storm the tavern. They dragged the injured Clodius out into the road, and there, on the stones of the Appian Way, they finished him off. The gang war had reached its logical, bloody conclusion. The champion of the people, the master of the Roman mob, was dead.
The news of Clodius's murder spread through Rome like a wildfire. His followers, the plebeians and the poor whom he had championed, were consumed with grief and rage. They retrieved his bloody body from the Appian Way and carried it directly into the heart of the city, to the Roman Forum. There, they laid his corpse out on the rostra, the speaker's platform, for all to see. The mood in the city grew increasingly tense and volatile. In their fury, the Clodian gangs and their supporters decided that their leader deserved a funeral pyre worthy of a king. They needed a grand and symbolic location. And so, in a moment of collective destructive rage, they stormed the Curia Hostilia, the ancient and venerable Senate House of Rome. They smashed the doors, broke up the wooden benches, desks, and official records, piling them all into a great heap inside the building. Then, they placed the body of Clodius on top of this makeshift pyre and set it all ablaze. The Senate House itself became Clodius's funeral pyre.
The fire raged out of control, consuming not just the Curia, but also the adjoining Basilica Porcia. The heart of Roman government was reduced to a smoking ruin by an enraged mob. This act of fiery desecration was the final, chaotic chapter in the story of the Republican gangs. It was a level of anarchy that shocked even the jaded Roman elite, and led to the Senate passing an emergency decree granting Pompey the Great sole consulship to restore order. The era of street gangs was over, but only because it was about to be replaced by the era of dictators and emperors. While the gangs of Clodius and Milo committed their crimes openly in the streets, a quieter, more respectable form of crime was being perfected in the halls of power. Let us now turn our attention from the violence of the mob to the subtle corruption of the elite. One of the most widespread of these white-collar crimes was ambitus, or electoral bribery. As the Republic decayed, political office became a path to immense wealth and power, particularly the governorship of a rich province. Competition for these offices was fierce, and candidates were willing to spend astronomical sums to secure a victory. The bribery was sophisticated and pervasive. A candidate would not simply hand out cash himself. He would employ agents, known as interpretes, to negotiate with the voters. Another level of agents, the sequestres, would hold the promised bribe money in escrow until after the vote. And finally, the divisores would be responsible for the actual distribution of the cash to the voters who had kept their end of the bargain. It was a complex and well-organized system. The voters themselves were often organized into clubs or guilds, the very same collegia that could be used as street gangs, which would negotiate a block vote for a certain price. The going rate for the vote of an entire guild could be staggering. Candidates would take out enormous loans to fund their campaigns, promising their creditors a handsome return once they secured a lucrative provincial governorship they could plunder. The entire political system became a cesspool of debt and corruption, where offices were not won by merit, but bought by the highest bidder. The ultimate prize for a corrupt politician was the governorship of a province. Far from the oversight of the Senate in Rome, a governor held almost absolute power for his term of office. This created an irresistible temptation for extortion and looting on a grand scale. The most notorious example of a corrupt provincial governor was Gaius Verres, who was the governor of the wealthy province of Sicily from 73 to 71 BC. His story, preserved in the brilliant prosecution speeches of Cicero, is a case study in Roman corruption. Verres treated Sicily as his personal treasure chest. He systematically plundered the province, using his legal authority as a cover for his crimes. He would demand that Sicilian farmers hand over huge portions of their grain harvest, far beyond the legal tax, which he would then sell for his own profit. He would invent false legal charges against wealthy landowners and then coerce them into paying him massive bribes to have the charges dropped. But his greatest crime was his obsession with art. Verres was a connoisseur of Greek art, and he used his position to steal masterpieces from every city and temple in Sicily. He would see a famous statue in a public square and simply order it to be taken down and shipped to his private collection. He would visit the homes of wealthy Sicilians, admire their family heirlooms, silver plate, tapestries, sculptures, and then force them to sell the items to him for a pittance, or simply confiscate them. He stripped the province bare, not just of its wealth, but of its cultural and religious heritage. By the time he left, he had amassed one of the largest private art collections in the Roman world, all of it stolen.
While governors like Verres were looting entire provinces, a quieter form of financial crime was playing out in the homes of the wealthy back in Rome: inheritance fraud. In a society obsessed with property, family lineage, and the transfer of wealth, the last will and testament was a document of immense importance. And where there is importance, there is opportunity for crime. Forgery of wills was a common and often difficult to detect offense. A skilled forger could create a completely fraudulent will, leaving a deceased person's entire estate to a conspirator. This often involved forging the seals of the witnesses, a difficult but not impossible task. A more common method was to acquire the real will and subtly alter it.
A forger might carefully unroll the papyrus scroll, use a sponge to wipe away the name of the true heir, and then deftly write in the name of his client or himself. The altered will would then be sealed back up, and the crime might go completely unnoticed. This crime was often an inside job. A disinherited relative, a greedy business partner, or even a trusted household slave might be involved. The satirist Petronius and the orator Cicero both speak of the prevalence of legacy hunters, predatory figures who would cozy up to wealthy, childless old men, hoping to be written into their will, and not above helping the process along with a bit of forgery after the man's death. It was a crime that preyed upon the foundational Roman values of family and property, turning a solemn final act into an opportunity for fraud. When fraud was not enough, a more direct and sinister method of securing an inheritance could be employed: poison. Poisoning was a crime that haunted the Roman imagination. It was seen as a secret, cowardly, and often undetectable weapon, frequently stereotyped as the tool of choice for ambitious women trapped in a patriarchal society. While this was a misogynistic trope, there is no doubt that poisoning was a real and present danger in the upper echelons of Roman society. The city was home to professional poison makers, often shadowy figures who dealt in rare herbs and dark magic. They could provide a client with a variety of toxic substances. Arsenic was a popular choice, as its symptoms, vomiting, stomach pains, could easily be mistaken for a bout of cholera or dysentery. Other poisons included aconite, derived from the wolfsbane plant, and hemlock, the famous poison used to execute Socrates. A skilled poisoner could administer a substance over a long period, creating the appearance of a slow, wasting illness, making it almost impossible to detect foul play. The motives were almost always greed or power. A wife might poison her husband to inherit his estate and be free to marry her lover. A son might poison his father to receive his inheritance more quickly. And in the imperial court, poison was a constant threat. The historian Tacitus describes a climate of paranoia where emperors and their rivals lived in constant fear of being poisoned by their wives, their siblings, or their advisors. The Emperor Clodius himself was widely believed to have been murdered by his own wife, Agrippina, who fed him a dish of poisoned mushrooms to ensure that her son, Nero, would ascend to the throne.
Let us return now from the quiet whisper of poison to the roar of a raging fire. Arson was another crime that plagued the city of Rome, a terrifying threat in a city where most buildings were made of wood and were packed tightly together. A fire, whether started by accident or on purpose, could destroy entire neighborhoods in a matter of hours, and this destructive power made it a potent tool for the ruthless and the greedy. The most famous figure associated with arson for profit was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the man who was part of the first triumvirate with Caesar and Pompey, and one of the richest men in Roman history. Crassus amassed a significant portion of his fortune through a particularly nefarious real estate scheme. He created his own private fire brigade, a team of over 500 slaves who were trained not just to fight fires, but also to serve as his agents. According to the historian Plutarch, when a building in Rome caught fire, Crassus and his fire brigade would rush to the scene, but they would not immediately start putting out the flames. Instead, Crassus would offer to buy the burning building and any adjacent properties threatened by the fire from their terrified owners. Because their properties were about to be destroyed, the owners were forced to sell at a ridiculously low price. Once the sale was complete, and only then, would Crassus order his private fire brigade to extinguish the flames. He would then rebuild the properties, often as larger and more profitable tenements, and rent them out. It was a brutal form of disaster capitalism, and there were strong suspicions that Crassus's agents were not just good at fighting fires, but were also very good at starting them.
While the wealthy feared the loss of their property, all Romans, rich and poor, feared the loss of their own liberty. Kidnapping, known in Latin as plagdium, was a serious and persistent crime throughout the Roman world. The motives were varied. A wealthy individual or their child might be kidnapped and held for a substantial ransom, but more often, the victims were ordinary people, snatched and sold into the vast, voracious machine of Roman slavery. The danger was most acute in the countryside and on the seas. Bandits, or latrones, roamed the rural highways, preying on travelers. They would ambush small groups, overwhelm them, and carry them off to be sold to a distant slave market where no one would recognize them. The sea was plagued by pirates, particularly those from Cilicia in the eastern Mediterranean. They would raid coastal towns and attack merchant ships, capturing not just the cargo, but the crew and passengers as well, all of whom were destined for the slave auction block. Perhaps the most famous kidnapping story from the ancient world is that of a young Julius Caesar. As the tale goes, on a journey to the east to study rhetoric, Caesar's ship was captured by Cilician pirates. When the pirates demanded a ransom of 20 talents, Caesar is said to have laughed in their faces, indignantly insisting that he was worth at least 50. While waiting for the ransom to be paid, he treated the pirates not as his captors, but as his audience, forcing them to listen to his speeches and poems. He jokingly promised them that once he was freed, he would return and have them all crucified. The pirates, amused by his arrogance, thought he was joking. He was not. After his ransom was paid and he was released, Caesar raised a small fleet, hunted down his former captors, and had them all executed, just as he had promised. The final two crimes on our tour are ones that reveal the deep superstitions and pieties of the Roman people. The first of these is tomb robbing. The Romans had a profound reverence for their ancestors and for the proper burial of the dead. A person's tomb was their final eternal home, their domus eterna, and ensuring its peace was a sacred duty. Great sums were often spent on constructing these tombs and filling them with grave goods, items the deceased might need or enjoy in the afterlife, such as pottery, lamps, jewelry, and coins. This, of course, made the tombs a tempting target for thieves. Tomb robbing was considered not just a theft, but an act of deep sacrilege, a violation of the peace of the dead. The crime was so common that many tombs were inscribed with dire warnings and curses, threatening any would-be violators with divine punishment, horrible diseases, or eternal torment. One inscription reads, "Should any man dare to violate this tomb, may he die the last of his family after suffering the most extreme tortures." Despite these threats, the lure of treasure was often too strong. Robbers would work at night, prying open sarcophagi or tunneling into family mausoleums to steal the valuable grave goods. This crime was deeply offensive to the Roman sense of pietas, the dutiful respect owed to one's family, one's country, and one's gods. The desecration of a tomb was an attack on the very fabric of Roman memory and tradition, a sign that nothing, not even the sanctity of the grave, was safe from the city's criminal element. Our final stop in this catalog of wickedness takes us into the realm of magic and superstition. While the Romans had their official state gods, many people also believed in a darker, more personal form of supernatural power. And one of the most feared crimes in this world of black magic was the creation of a cursed tablet, or defixio. A defixio was a tool for channeling supernatural anger against an enemy. It was typically a small, thin sheet of lead, a metal considered to be cold and sinister. On this sheet, a person would inscribe a curse directed at a specific individual. The curse would call upon the gods of the underworld, figures like Pluto, Proserpina, or the Furies, to inflict harm upon the victim. The language was often vicious and graphic, wishing upon the target everything from financial ruin and social disgrace to physical torment, paralysis, and a painful death. The text was often written backwards or in a spiral or with strange magical symbols, all intended to increase its dark power. Once the curse was written, the tablet would be activated by being pierced with a nail, a symbolic fixing or binding of the victim. It would then be deposited in a place believed to be close to the underworld, where the gods could hear it. Common locations were graves, wells, or sacred springs. Archaeologists have found hundreds of these cursed tablets all across the Roman Empire. They were used to curse a rival in a lawsuit, an opponent in a chariot race, a romantic rival, or a thief who had stolen from the author. It was a secret, supernatural crime, a way for the powerless to seek revenge, and a practice that reveals the deep well of fear, envy, and malice that ran just beneath the surface of Roman society.
We have now walked the dark streets, met the muggers and the gangs, and uncovered the silent crimes of the elite. An obvious question arises from this tour of the Roman underworld. Who was responsible for stopping any of this? When a citizen's house was burgled or their purse was stolen, who did they turn to? The answer, for most of Rome's long history, is both simple and shocking. Nobody. The city of Rome, for all its architectural grandeur and legal sophistication, had no professional police force in the modern sense of the word. There was no detective division to investigate a murder, no patrol officers to whom you could report a theft. The concept of the state being responsible for the day-to-day safety of its citizens was largely alien to the Roman mindset. Justice was, for the most part, a private matter. The responsibility for preventing crime, for catching criminals, and for seeking legal redress fell almost entirely on the shoulders of the individual victim. This created a system that was heavily biased towards the wealthy and the powerful. A rich man who was wronged could use his own resources, his network of clients, his slaves, his money, to investigate the crime and pursue the perpetrator. A poor man had nothing but his own two hands. This lack of state-sponsored law enforcement is perhaps the single most important factor in understanding why crime was so rampant in the city. The darkness was deep, and for the average Roman, there was no one to call for help.
The first real attempt to create any kind of public law enforcement body came under the reign of the first emperor, Augustus. Rome had always been plagued by devastating fires, and after a particularly bad one, Augustus established a new permanent public service, the Corps of Vigiles. Their full title was the Vigiles Urbani, the Watchmen of the City. They were a corps of about 7,000 men, mostly freedmen, organized into 7 cohorts, with each cohort responsible for 2 of the city's 14 districts. Their primary job, first and foremost, was to be a fire brigade. They were on duty all night, every night, patrolling the streets. Their equipment consisted of axes for breaking down doors, grappling hooks for pulling down burning material, and buckets for carrying water. They would stand guard at public buildings and were tasked with warning citizens to be careful with their lamps and cooking fires. But because they were a uniformed body patrolling the streets at night, they inevitably took on a secondary, police-like role. While they had limited legal authority, they became the de facto keepers of the peace after dark. They would break up brawls that spilled out of taverns. They would intervene in noisy domestic disputes. They were tasked with capturing burglars and muggers if they could, and they were particularly responsible for hunting down runaway slaves, one of the most common nighttime offenses. They were not detectives, and their powers were limited, but the Vigiles were the first glimmer of a state-run institution dedicated to keeping the city safe.
Let us imagine a typical night on patrol with a unit of the Vigiles. You are a freedman, perhaps a former carpenter or baker, now enlisted in this new corps. Your station is a small barracks or excubatorium where you and your fellow watchmen are quartered. Your shift begins as darkness falls. You are issued your equipment, a heavy woolen cloak to ward off the night chill, a helmet, a simple axe, and a long pole with a grappling hook on the end. Your primary mission is fire prevention. You walk your assigned route in a small group, your heavy sandals echoing on the stone streets. Your eyes are constantly scanning the towering, dark shapes of the insulae. You are looking for the telltale flicker of an unattended lamp too close to a curtain, or the smell of smoke where there shouldn't be any. You have the authority to enter buildings to inspect for fire hazards and to administer on-the-spot corporal punishment to those who are careless. But your attention is constantly divided. You hear a shout from a side alley. You and your squad rush towards the sound, axes at the ready. You find two men brawling outside a wine shop. You intervene, separating them, your presence as uniformed officials enough to quell the dispute. Later, you might be approached by a citizen who claims his apartment has been broken into. You cannot investigate, but you can take a report and keep an eye out for any suspicious characters selling used pottery in the market the next day. You are part fireman, part night watchman, part social workers, an imperfect but essential presence in the sleeping city.
While the vigilists handled the low-level disturbances of the night, a more imposing force was responsible for maintaining public order during the day, especially in times of crisis. These were the urban cohorts, the cohortes urbanae. If the vigilists were the fire department with some police powers, the urban cohorts were more like a heavily armed gendarmerie or a SWAT team, responsible for riot control and security in the capital. Also established by Augustus, the urban cohorts were a paramilitary force of several thousand men. Unlike the freedmen of the vigilists, these were citizen soldiers, and they were equipped as such, with swords, shields, and armor, just like regular legionaries. They were under the command of the urban prefect, one of the most powerful officials in the city. Their primary role was to act as a deterrent to large-scale public disorder. During a grain shortage, when riots might break out of the markets, the urban cohorts would be deployed to restore order. During contentious games at the Circus Maximus, they would patrol the stands to prevent fights between rival factions of chariot racing fans. And during the fiery aftermath of Clodius's murder, it was the urban cohorts, under the special command of Pompey, who were finally able to quell the mob and secure the city. They were rarely seen on a day-to-day basis, but their presence was a constant reminder of the state's power to crush any serious threat to its authority. They were not there to solve crimes, but to crack down on dissent and mob violence with overwhelming force.
So we have established the reality of law enforcement in Rome. There were no detectives to investigate your case. The vigiles might stumble upon a crime in progress, but they were not an investigatory body. The urban cohorts were there to suppress riots, not to solve burglaries. The responsibility, therefore, fell upon the victim. This system of private justice is what truly defined the Roman legal experience for the average person. If you were wronged, you had to take the initiative. This meant that your access to justice was directly proportional to your personal resources. A wealthy man could hire investigators, he could lean on his network of powerful friends, he could use his own slaves to track down witnesses or suspects. A poor man had only his own time and energy. This reality meant that the vast majority of crimes, particularly those committed against the poor, went completely unpunished. It was often safer and more practical for a victim to simply accept their loss rather than risk confronting a dangerous criminal or becoming entangled in a complex and expensive legal process. But if a victim was determined to seek justice, and if they had managed to identify a suspect, Roman law provided a formal procedure. It was a procedure that was, like so much in Rome, both highly legalistic and intensely personal. It began not with a warrant issued by a judge, but with a direct, face-to-face confrontation between the plaintiff and the accused. The pursuit of justice in Rome began with an act of personal courage.
The first step in a Roman lawsuit was the in ius vocatio, the calling to court. This was a formal verbal summons. The plaintiff, the victim of the crime, had to find the person they were accusing, confront them in person, wherever they might be, in the street, in the market, at the baths, and declare, "In ius te voco," I call you to court. This was not a polite request. It was a legal command, backed by the force of ancient tradition. The accused person was then legally obligated to accompany the plaintiff immediately to the magistrate's court in the forum. If they refused to go, the plaintiff was entitled to use physical force to drag them there. He could call upon any nearby citizens as witnesses, saying, "Licet antestari? May I call you to witness?" And they were expected to confirm that the summons had been legally issued and refused. This made the act of summoning someone to court a potentially dramatic and violent public spectacle. Imagine the scene. A merchant confronts the man he believes has stolen from his shop. He points a finger and shouts the formula. The accused, a burly man with friends nearby, refuses. The merchant calls on the crowd for witnesses, and then he and his own friends attempt to physically seize the accused and haul him through the busy streets to the forum. It was a system that relied on self-help, and it heavily favored the strong and the well-connected. A weak or friendless person would have a very difficult time successfully calling a powerful or violent individual to court. The first step of the legal process was, in itself, a test of strength.
If the plaintiff successfully brought the defendant before the magistrate, usually the praetor, they would enter the next stage of the process. This was not a trial. It was a preliminary hearing, a formal procedure to determine if there was a valid case to be heard. The Roman legal system was incredibly formalistic. Everything depended on using the correct formulas, the precise legal language that had been established by tradition. Both the plaintiff and the defendant would have to state their case according to a strict script. Any deviation, any mistake in the wording could result in the magistrate throwing the case out immediately. The plaintiff would state his claim, for example, "I declare that this man has stolen a silver cup from me, valued at 100 sesterces." The defendant would then have to formally deny it. The praetor's job was not to determine who was telling the truth, but simply to determine the correct legal formula that applied to the case, and to appoint a private citizen, the iudex, to be the judge who would actually hear the evidence. This reliance on archaic formulas and rigid procedures meant that legal expertise was essential. While a citizen could technically represent themselves, it was incredibly risky. This led to the rise of the Roman lawyer, the advocatus. An advocate was not just a skilled public speaker, he was an expert in the complex and often baffling language of the law. He knew the right words to say, the right procedures to follow, and the right legal precedents to cite. For anyone hoping to succeed in a Roman court, hiring a good advocate was the first and most crucial step.
Once the praetor had approved the case and appointed an iudex, the actual trial, the judicium, could begin. Roman trials were very public affairs. They were often held outdoors in one of the great basilicas that lined the forum. A basilica was not a church, but a large open-air public hall with a high roof held up by columns. The court would be set up at one end, often on a raised platform. The scene would be one of organized chaos. The iudex, a respected citizen but not necessarily a legal expert, would preside over the case. On either side were the advocates for the plaintiff and the defendant, ready to give their speeches. Witnesses would be called to give evidence, and both sides would have the opportunity to cross-examine them. But surrounding this formal procedure was a large, noisy, and often boisterous crowd of onlookers. Trials were a popular form of public entertainment. Citizens would gather to watch the legal drama unfold, to listen to the powerful oratory of the advocates, and to offer their own unsolicited comments on the proceedings. The advocates' speeches were the centerpiece of the trial. A Roman lawyer's goal was not just to present the facts, but to win over the judge and the crowd with the power of his rhetoric. He would use emotional appeals, character assassination, dramatic gestures, and soaring language. He was part lawyer, part actor, part showman. The trial was a battle of narratives, a contest to see who could tell the more convincing story. After the speeches and the evidence, the iudex would deliver his verdict. He would either find for the plaintiff or the defendant. There was no appeal. His word was final.
Once a verdict of guilty was delivered, the question of punishment arose. And it is here that we see the Roman legal system at its most brutal and unequal. The punishment a person received had very little to do with the crime they had committed, and everything to do with their social status. Roman law, particularly in the imperial period, made a formal distinction between two classes of people. The first were the honestores, the more honorable ones. This was the elite. Senators, equestrians, wealthy landowners, and high-ranking public officials. The second were the humiliores, the more humble ones. This category included everyone else, the vast majority of the population, from poor citizens and freedmen to foreigners and slaves. This two-tiered system was not a subtle bias, it was an explicit and fundamental principle of Roman justice. The law stated plainly that the two classes were to be punished differently for the exact same offenses. The underlying philosophy was that the bodies of the honestores were, in a sense, sacred and could not be subjected to the same degrading and torturous punishments as the bodies of the common folk. This meant that for any given crime, there were two separate menus of potential punishments. One was designed to punish the elite without causing them physical pain or public humiliation. The other was designed to do exactly that, to inflict maximum pain and to turn the punishment of the lower classes into a terrifying public spectacle that would serve as a warning to others. The scales of Roman justice were, by their design, uneven.
Let us first consider the punishments reserved for the elite. If a wealthy senator, an honestor, was found guilty of a serious crime like corruption, treason, or even manslaughter, he would be shielded from the brutal physical punishments meted out to the lower classes. He would not be flogged, crucified, or thrown to the beasts. Instead, his punishment was designed to attack his status, his property, and his identity as a Roman. A common punishment was a massive fine, the multa, which could effectively bankrupt him. An even more serious sentence was the confiscation of his entire estate, stripping his family of its wealth and legacy. But the most severe punishment for a member of the elite was exile. There were two forms of this. The milder form was relegatio, where the convicted person was banished to a specific location, often a remote and unpleasant island, for a set period or for life. They retained their citizenship and property, but were removed from Roman society. The ultimate punishment was deportation, which was considered a form of civil death. The convicted person was stripped of their Roman citizenship. All of their property was confiscated by the state, and they were exiled permanently to a barren rock in the sea, like the island of Gyarros. They were erased from Roman society. For a status-obsessed aristocrat, this was a fate considered by some to be worse than a quick death. It was the complete annihilation of their identity and their family's place in the world.
Now, let us consider the fate of a humilior, a common person, convicted of the same serious crime. He would not face the civilized punishments of a fine or exile. His body was not considered sacred. Instead, his punishment was designed to be a gruesome public spectacle, a tool of terror to keep the lower classes in line. One of the most feared of these punishments was damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. This sentence would be carried out in the amphitheater as part of the public games. It was a highlight of the midday entertainment, along with the execution of criminals. The condemned person, the bestiarios, would be sent out into the arena,
either unarmed or with a useless symbiotic weapon, to face hungry and enraged wild animals. Lions, bears, leopards, and wild boars would be released from cages beneath the sand, and the crowd would watch as the helpless victim was mauled and torn apart. This was not seen by the Romans as a simple execution. It was a highly symbolic act. It was a demonstration of the power of the Roman state over both humanity and nature. The criminal, by breaking the law, had placed himself outside the bounds of human society. He was therefore reduced to the level of a wild animal and was killed by them, his humanity stripped away in his final moments for the entertainment of the masses. It was a terrifying and deeply degrading end, a powerful warning to anyone in the crowd who might consider breaking the law.
Even more infamous than being thrown to the beasts was the punishment of crucifixion. This was perhaps the most agonizing and humiliating form of execution ever devised, and the Romans used it extensively, particularly for slaves, pirates, and rebels. It was a punishment designed for maximum pain and public deterrence. The victim was first subjected to a brutal scourging, the verberatio, which would leave their back a raw, bleeding mess. They were then often forced to carry their own crossbeam, the patibulum, through the streets to the place of execution, a final, shameful parade. The execution site was always outside the city walls, typically along a busy public highway. The goal was to make the punishment as visible as possible. There, the victim was nailed or tied to the cross, where they would hang for hours, sometimes days, slowly dying from a combination of blood loss, asphyxiation, and dehydration. It was an excruciatingly slow and painful death suffered in the full view of every traveler coming in from the city. The bodies were often left on the crosses to rot and be eaten by carrion birds, a final act of desecration.
We have now explored the dark streets, the varied crimes, and the brutal, unequal justice of ancient Rome. To conclude our journey, let us delve into one single true story, a court case from the year 80 BC that contains all of these elements: a gruesome murder, a conspiracy born of greed, the corruption of a powerful political figure, and a dramatic courtroom battle that hinged on the courage of one young man. This is the story of the trial of Sextus Roscius of Ameria. Our story begins with a crime. A wealthy and respected landowner, also named Sextus Roscius, is found murdered in the streets of Rome after a dinner party. Murder was common, but this was different. Soon after, his son, Sextus Roscius the Younger, is publicly accused of the most heinous crime in Roman society: parricide, the murder of his own father. This was a charge that carried a unique and horrific penalty designed to reflect the crime's unnatural horror. The traditional punishment for parricide was the pone coulae, the penalty of the sack. The condemned man would be scourged and then sewn alive into a heavy leather sack, along with a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey. The sack would then be tied shut and thrown into the river Tiber to sink. It was a punishment of almost unimaginable terror, designed to not only kill the man, but to utterly annihilate him, denying him a proper burial and consigning his spirit to eternal torment. This was the fate that awaited the young Sextus Roscius if he were found guilty.
The young Roscius, terrified, went into hiding. But who had accused him, and why? The architects of the accusation were two of his own relatives, Titus Roscius Capito and Titus Roscius Magnus. They claimed that the son had his father killed because of a family dispute. But the real story, as would later be revealed, was a dark conspiracy rooted in greed and the bloody political turmoil of the time. Rome in 80 BC was living in the shadow of the dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla had won a brutal civil war and had instituted the proscriptions, a terrifying political purge. He published lists of his enemies, and anyone on the list could be legally hunted down and killed by any citizen, with their property being confiscated by the state and then auctioned off at a discount. It was a reign of terror, but it was also an opportunity for the corrupt to get rich. This is where the true motive lay. After the elder Roscius was murdered, his relatives, Capito and Magnus, conspired with a powerful and feared freedman of the dictator Sulla, a man named Lucius Cornelius Chrysogonus. They secretly had the dead man's name added to the proscription lists, even though the proscriptions had officially ended. This allowed them to purchase his 13 valuable country estates worth a fortune for a ridiculously low price. To cover their tracks and eliminate the rightful heir, they then accused the son of the very murder they had likely orchestrated themselves.
The conspiracy was as brilliant as it was evil. The young Sextus Roscius was trapped. The charge of parricide was so horrific that it stained him immediately, and the involvement of Chrysogonus, Sulla's powerful favorite, made the case untouchable. No established powerful advocate in Rome would dare to take on the defense. To defend Roscius would mean publicly accusing Chrysogonus, and by extension, challenging the authority of the dictator Sulla himself. It was a career-ending and potentially life-ending risk. The great orators of the day all refused the case. It seemed that the young Roscius was doomed, destined to be convicted and thrown into the Tiber in a sack. But then, one man stepped forward. He was a young lawyer, only 26 or 27 years old at the time. He was ambitious and brilliant, but he had not yet made a name for himself. He had no powerful family connections to protect him. His name was Marcus Tullius Cicero. Cicero saw the case not just as a legal challenge, but as a moral one and a massive opportunity. He knew the risks were immense. If he lost, his client would suffer a horrific death. If he won, but offended Sulla's regime, he himself might end up on a proscription list. But it was a chance to make his name on the biggest possible stage, to fight for justice against a corrupt and powerful conspiracy. With incredible courage, Cicero agreed to take the case and defend the life of Sextus Roscius.
The trial began, held in the open air of the Forum. The prosecution laid out its case, painting the young Roscius as a degenerate and ungrateful son who had his father murdered. They had witnesses, they had motive, and they had the silent, intimidating backing of Chrysogonus and the Sullan regime. The atmosphere was one of fear. It seemed to be an open and shut case. Then it was Cicero's turn to speak, and the speech he gave, which we can still read today, is a masterpiece of legal strategy and political courage. Cicero knew he could not directly attack the dictator Sulla, so he did something brilliant. He began by praising Sulla, calling him a great and busy man who, in his noble work of restoring the state, could not possibly be aware of the vile and corrupt deeds being done in his name by his underlings. He separated the unimpeachable dictator from his wicked favorite. He then shifted his focus squarely onto the conspirators. With devastating logic and soaring rhetoric, he began to dismantle the prosecution's case. He pointed out the absurdity of the situation. Why would the son, who was set to inherit everything, murder his father? Who truly benefited from the crime? Not the son, who was now a fugitive, but the relatives and Chrysogonus, who now owned the dead man's valuable estates. He painted a vivid picture of a vulture, Chrysogonus, swooping down to feed on the carrion of the civil wars. Cicero was not just defending his client. He was putting the corruption of the era on trial.
Cicero's strategy was incredibly risky. He was walking a tightrope. At every moment, he had to be careful not to seem as though he was criticizing the dictator Sulla, while simultaneously exposing the crimes of Sulla's most powerful freedman, Chrysogonus. He masterfully turned the case on its head.
He argued that the real threat to the Roman state was not his client, but men like Chrysogonus, who were abusing the new order for their own greedy ends and making a mockery of Sulla's attempts to restore justice. He appealed directly to the judges, reminding them of their duty to uphold the law and to protect the innocent from the powerful. He systematically destroyed the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses, showing them to be liars and conspirators. He then daringly summoned one of the conspirators, Titus Roscius Capito, to the stand and cross-examined him with such ferocity that the man's guilt became plain for all to see. But his most powerful argument was an emotional one. He painted a picture of his client, Sextus Roscius, as the ultimate victim. A young man who had first lost his beloved father to murderers, then had his inheritance stolen by his own relatives, and was now being framed for the crime and was facing a horrific death. He was a man who had lost everything and was now about to lose his life based on the lies of the very men who had orchestrated his ruin. Through the power of his oratory, Cicero transformed Roscius from a suspected parricide into a tragic figure, a symbol of the suffering endured by many during the bloody civil wars.
Against all odds, against all political pressure, Cicero's brilliant and courageous defense worked. The judges, perhaps emboldened by Cicero's careful separation of Chrysogonus from Sulla and swayed by the power of his arguments, delivered their verdict. Sextus Roscius was acquitted. He was declared innocent of all charges. It was a stunning legal victory and a public humiliation for the powerful Chrysogonus. The young, unknown lawyer had taken on the most dangerous case in Rome and had won. The Roscius affair launched Cicero's career, establishing his reputation as the most brilliant and fearless advocate of his generation. It was the first major step on the path that would eventually lead him to the consulship and the title of Pater Patriae, Father of the Country. He had shown that the power of words, the power of truth and justice, could, on rare occasions, be stronger than the power of corruption and political terror. The story serves as a perfect capstone to our exploration of Roman crime. It contains all the elements: a violent street murder, a conspiracy born of greed, the corruption of the powerful, and a deeply flawed legal system. But it also contains a glimmer of hope. It shows that even in the darkest of times, an individual with enough courage and skill could stand up to the system and, against all odds, make justice prevail.
And so our long night in the Roman underworld comes to an end. We have walked its dark and dangerous streets. We have met its criminals, from the lowly mugger to the corrupt senator. And we have witnessed its strange and brutal system of justice. It was a world of profound contradictions, a city of magnificent law and rampant lawlessness, of deep piety and shocking cruelty. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I hope it has given you a different view of the Eternal City, a glimpse into the shadows that lay just behind the marble facades. May the stories of this long-forgotten world provide a quiet backdrop for your own rest, and may your night be peaceful and safe.